Savarkar's vision for India, it's complicated, unsettling at times even.
Wow, absolutely.
To really get it, to get under the surface, we need to go right to the source.
Right to the source.
And thankfully, you've brought us some, well, fascinating stuff, excerpts from English Hindu Rashtra Darshan.pdf.
Yeah.
It's a collection of his speeches, right?
It is, yeah. Speeches to the Hindu Mahasabha.
And not just any speeches, these were
Presidential addresses.
delivered when? When were these given?
Between 1937 and 1943.
Wow.
A pivotal moment, to say the least. India's future hanging in the balance.
And he lays out, well, his vision for a Hindu nation. One of the first things that struck me just reading through these was how he defines Hindu. It's not just about religion, is it?
No, not at all. For Savarkar, Hindu, that wasn't just a religious category. It was the defining characteristic of a nation. Hindustan.
Hindustan, yeah.
He believed they were united by blood, by their history.
A shared past?
A shared sacred geography, even. The Saptasindhus, the 7 rivers of ancient India.
So it's this vision of nationhood, but it's deeply intertwined with a shared past.
Absolutely.
And with a specific cultural landscape.
That goes deep, yeah.
And that vision, it put him at odds with a lot of people, didn't it? Those who were advocating for a broader Indian identity, a more inclusive one.
Precisely. You had figures like Gandhi championing this more inclusive civic nationalism. But Savarkar, he saw that as dangerous, even a betrayal of Hindu heritage.
A delusion.
Delusion, yeah.
Yeah.
He truly felt that Hindus, assimilating into this broader Indian identity, that would be their downfall, their subjugation.
Which brings us to his views on history, particularly what he saw as centuries of conflict with Muslim rulers. He cites invasions like those by, Mahmud of Ghazni.
Mahmud of Ghazni, yes.
And the policies of Mughal emperors like Aurangzeb.
Right, Aurangzeb.
He paints a very stark picture of Hindu suffering.
He does. And he uses this narrative, this history, to justify his anxieties about the future. For Savarkar, the past wasn't just the past, it was a warning, a very stark warning.
And that warning, as I understand it, was that a separate Muslim state that would inevitably lead to more conflict.
Exactly, and to the subjugation of Hindus.
And he really drives this point home by drawing these parallels to European conflicts, right?
He does, yeah. I mean, he even goes so far as to compare the demand for Pakistan to the Sudetenland crisis, right before World War II.
His interpretation of the Khilafat movement is, well, revealing.
It is. For those who may not be familiar, the Khilafat movement, that was a pan-Islamic movement in the early 1920s, supporting the Ottoman Caliphate.
Right.
Savarkar, he criticized the involvement of Indian Muslims in that movement. He saw their participation as proof of their extraterritorial loyalties.
They were putting their religious ties
above their national identity.
Above their Indian identity.
And that was a key piece of his argument against Muslim separatism, the key piece.
And it's this fear of Muslim separatism, right, that leads him to advocate for a very different path than Gandhi. Savarkar believed Hindus needed to be strong, militarily strong, politically strong.
He did. He saw nonviolence as, a recipe for disaster.
Leaving Hindus vulnerable.
Vulnerable. Especially in a world where, others were arming themselves.
Arming themselves, yeah.
And this wasn't just theoretical for him. Savarkar, he passionately believed that Hindus, they should be a force to be reckoned with in the army, in the government, in industry.
Everywhere.
Everywhere. A Hindu resurgence on all fronts. He called for it.
I'm struck by this comparison he makes between Gandhi's nonviolence and Jainism.
Jainism, right.
It seems like a contradiction, given Jainism's emphasis on nonviolence. Why make that comparison?
Because he argued that even Jains, despite their deeply held commitment to nonviolence, there were times, historically, where they recognized the need for self-defense. And he uses this example to bolster his argument that nonviolence, while morally admirable, in his view, it's ultimately impractical.
Even detrimental.
Detrimental, yes, when you're facing these existential threats.
And for Savarkar, pacifism.
Pacifism equaled powerlessness. No two ways about it.
So then, how did this desire for Hindu strength, how did that influence his view of the British? Because they were, let's not forget, a foreign power ruling over India.
This is what makes Savarkar so complex, isn't it? His stance on the British, it's one of the most, controversial aspects of his ideology, for sure. He acknowledged British rule as a form of subjugation. He wasn't blind to that.
Right.
But he also saw them as a potential ally.
Against a greater threat.
Against the greater threat, the threat of Muslim dominance.
So it's like he's walking this tightrope.
He is.
Navigating between resistance and then what do you call it?
Responsive cooperation.
Right, responsive cooperation.
Yeah.
So basically, work with the British, but only when it serves Hindu interests.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he really pushed for Hindus to join the military.
Under British rule.
Under British rule.
Yeah.
He saw as a way for Hindus to get training, experience, things he thought they desperately need in an independent India.
Especially if they had to face...
A hostile Muslim state.
exactly.
So a calculated risk.
To say the least, yeah.
But it does make you think about, well, unity
Right.
within Hindu society itself. Because Savarkar, he was surprisingly progressive on one issue that really divided Indians.
Untouchability.
Yeah.
He condemned it outright.
totally.
Called it a blot on Hindu society, said it weakened them from within.
Which was not a popular stance at the time, let me tell you.
I bet.
But Savarkar, he truly believed that a united Hindu society, it couldn't exist with those kinds of divisions. He saw getting rid of untouchability, that was crucial for building up Hindu strength.
So it makes you wonder, was this just like a pragmatic stance?
Right.
A way to consolidate power?
Yeah.
Or did he really believe in dismantling the caste system?
It's hard to say.
Yeah.
It really is.
Yeah.
And that's what makes Savarkar so fascinating to study. He was this staunch advocate for Hindu supremacy, right?
Right.
But he also recognized that the caste system, with all its inequalities, it undermined the very unity that he wanted.
It's a good reminder, isn't it, that these historical figures, they don't always fit into our modern categories, left and right.
They don't know.
Their views could be progressive and problematic all at the same time.
Absolutely.
And Savarkar's vision, with this emphasis on Hindu identity, cultural resurgence, it still resonates in India today.
It does, yeah. There's no doubt it's had a profound impact. I mean, some would say he laid the groundwork for the rise of Hindu nationalism in Indian politics.
It's a perspective worth considering, for sure.
It is. While Savarkar, he might not have, envisioned the specifics, the ins and outs of how Indian politics look today, his emphasis on this Hindu identity, this cultural assertion, well, it's resonated.
With certain groups, for sure.
Oh, yeah.
But it's also a vision that's been, criticized.
Of course.
For making religious tensions worse, for potentially contributing to violence.
And it's a valid concern. Savarkar's rhetoric, his talk of Hindu strength, his anxieties about Muslim separatism, while it was all rooted in the context of his time, you can definitely see how it could be interpreted as fueling fear, distrust.
Right.
And it's the reminder that words have power, that even well-intentioned ideologies, they can have unintended consequences.
It all comes back to this question, doesn't it? Was Savarkar's vision, this Hindu nation, was it a necessary response to the challenges of his time?
Right.
Or did it plant the seeds of future conflict?
It's a question historians are still debating.
And a debate that, it goes beyond Savarkar himself.
It does.
His ideas, they force us to think about, some uncomfortable truths, about identity, power, the legacy of colonialism.
Big questions.
Big questions, yeah. Questions that, frankly, any nation that's, grappling with its past, with its future, they have to address these questions.
At some point, yeah.
It's like you said earlier, the past isn't just the past.
That's right.
It shapes how we see the world today.
Yeah.
How we make choices about the future.
And understanding those choices, the anxieties and the aspirations, what drove people, that's essential for navigating the world today.
Right. Savarkar, at the end of his addresses, he had this call for a Hindu renaissance.
Yeah.
If he were here today, 21st century, what do you think he'd make of India?
Oh, that's a good question.
Would he think his hopes were realized?
Would he even recognize it?
Or has India taken a very different path? On the one hand, you can't deny it, there's a resurgence of Hindu identity in India today.
There is.
That might have, been what he envisioned. This Hindi nation.
You could definitely argue that. The rise of these political parties espousing Hindu nationalist ideologies, you could see that as validation of his ideas.
Yeah.
And yet, India today.
Yeah. It's this tapestry of different faiths, different cultures.
It is.
It's a far cry from that monolithic vision.
Yeah. The Hindustan that Savarkar imagined.
Yeah.
It's hard to say, really. But, India, it chose a secular path.
It did.
Embracing this more inclusive idea of what it means to be Indian.
Right.
Even if it meant, compromising. on this vision of a Hindu nation-state.
And the social and economic challenges, I mean, those persist too.
Oh, absolutely.
He talked about Hindu dominance, right?
He did.
In industry, in government.
Mhm.
And, well, inequality is still a major issue.
It is.
Would he see that as a failure of his vision,
Mhm.
or a sign that, the work's not finished yet?
It's so hard to know what he'd make of it all.
Yeah.
But what we do know is that his life, his ideas, they're a powerful lens for understanding India today,
They really are.
the forces that shaped the nation. His story, it's this reminder, you know, about the legacy of colonialism, about the complexities of national identity, and the power of ideas
To shape history.
to shape history. Exactly.
It's been, well, I'll be honest, it's been a journey.
Oh, yeah.
Unpacking these ideas.
Fascinating stuff.
Savarkar's vision, it was this blend, right, of pragmatism
Right.
and deep-seated anxieties.
Yeah.
And it still gets people talking.
It does. It makes you think.
And that's what's so great about engaging with history. It's not about the dates, the names. It's about the big questions.
The questions that we're still wrestling with today, in a way.
Exactly.
So to everyone listening, here's something to think about. Savarkar, he wanted a Hindu Renaissance.
He did.
But what would a truly inclusive Indian Renaissance look like? One that embraces the past, the good and the bad, but looks towards a shared future.
A future for everyone.
Something to ponder. As we keep exploring these fascinating depths of history,